Hello, this is Eric, and this is In Focus. And I'd like to discuss with you today one of my favorite books of the Bible, and it's the book of Esther. Now, the book of Esther is a really interesting story. It's about a young lady of Jewish descent living in Persia at the tail end of her people's captivity in Babylon due to the people of Judah's and Jerusalem's sins, and God warning them for hundreds of years to amend their ways and repent, and they didn't do it. So what ended up happening is, starting around 607 BC and going to 586 BC, there was 3 waves of exile. In one of these waves of exile, Esther's family was taken into captivity to Babylon. Now, Babylon would eventually be conquered by the Medes, and then the power would be turned over from the Medes to the Persians. And the Persians are the ones who's in charge right now. And where Esther lives is in the capital city of Susa, which was the capital of Persia. And what ends up happening in the story is, at the beginning of the book, King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus in Hebrew, holds an absolutely enormous banquet, a big party, big celebration. And there's wine flowing and richest of food and everything else. And the entire town, the whole city, small and great, are involved in this celebration. So at the apex of this festival, this celebration, he sends orders to his queen by the name of Vashti to come and let him display her beauty. Vashti refuses. Well, this angers Xerxes, because back in that day, these things weren't done. So he turns to his elders and says, well, what am I going to do? I mean, she just basically thumbed her nose at me and said, no way, Jose. Or as my middle son used to say, no way, Jose. And what are we going to do about this? So his advisors, like Council of 7 advisors, basically said, listen, if you don't do something about this, what's going to happen is it's going to get across the kingdom that your queen defied you, and we're going to have wives defying their husbands all over the kingdom, and then society is going to just descend into chaos. You can't let this stand. So what he ends up doing is he ends up exiling Vashti, and he deposes her, and basically holds a beauty pageant of all virgin young ladies who are marriage age, to find out who his next queen's going to be. It's almost like a reality show. Who's the next queen of Persia? So basically ends up happening is that's what happens. Well, this young lady by the name of Esther ends up catching the eye of the officials who are gathering contestants for this beauty pageant. And she's very beautiful, and she's got a nice figure and everything else. So they take her to be one of the contestants, and she ends up winning. And we're going to discuss those circumstances around that even further in a few minutes. But her uncle's nephew, by the name of Mordecai, he ends up ascending to a position of some importance inside the city gate, working for King Xerxes' administration. He's one of his officials, minor at the time. And basically ends up happening is he finds out about it, and he tells Esther, don't tell anybody you're Jewish, because you'll put yourself and everybody else who knows you in peril. Just leave your ancestry out of this for the time being. So she does. Now, what ends up happening is that her character as well as her beauty ends up impressing one of the chief chamberlains, one of the chief butlers, if you will, of the king. And he ends up taking an immediate shine to her, and he pretty much kind of stacks the deck for Esther. And like I said, it's a wonderful web of things that just so happen in this book. And I guess that's the other point I'd like to get to, what I love about this book. And that is that God's name is not mentioned one time in the book of Esther. Neither is he alluded to. Now, that's highly unusual for a book of the Bible, so much to the point that the scholars who put together the 39 books, what we call as Christians the Old Testament, and what the Jewish people call the Tanakh, or their Bible, they debated whether or not Esther should even be in there, just simply because, well, God's not mentioned. But then they discovered something, I think, as they pored over the text. And that is, where God's name is not mentioned, his fingerprints are still there. What do I mean by that? Well, simply this. I think one of the most important passages of this book, that's kind of like the theme of the entire book, I think, is found in chapter 4, starting at verse 12. What's happening at this point in time is there's a guy by the name of Haman. Now, he's an Amalekite who is a descendant from a king called Agag. He's an Agagite, which means he descends from Agag, who was a Amalekite king whom King Saul, the first king of Israel, several hundred years before, was told by God, you are to kill every single one of the Amalekites that were a part of this raiding party, because they end up raiding and attacking Israel, and God said, kill them all. And the reason being is this particular group of people, the Amalekites, became the Jewish people's enemies all the way back when they came out of Egypt. They were coming out of Egypt, and Israel wasn't looking for any trouble. They basically said, hey, listen, we would like to pass through your land, and if, we do pass through your land, we promise we won't eat anything that's yours. If we use any resources, we will pay for them. We're not here to cause trouble. We're just to get to where our home is, our new home. Some kingdoms would let them pass through. Others would not. The Amalekites came right out and attacked them. I believe this is recorded in the 14th chapter of Exodus. And they just set upon them and just attacked them savagely, to the point where God declared that he was going to wage war against the Amalekites as long as they existed. Because it seems like this attitude of hostility towards Israel pervaded all the way several hundred years into the future, when we come across this gentleman by the name of Haman, when I use that word very loosely, who started having his problems when he was elevated in the second chapter of Esther to being the prime minister, the second in command of all of Persia, and it was said, bow before him, make a big deal out of him. Everybody did that except for Mordecai. And that is, remember, Mordecai is the one who is raising Esther as his own daughter, because her parents end up getting killed. So he ended up taking her in and raising her as his own child. So he refuses to bow before Haman. We don't know why. We don't know if it's because of his religious convictions, that he only bow before God. We don't know if it's because he knew that Haman was an Amalekite and descendant, and considering he was a court official for Xerxes, he may have known this, because even among people such as the Medes and the Persians, a lot of credence was given to your lineage. Okay, so may very well knew that he was an Amalekite. He was a descendant of King Agag, and that the Amalekites were just mortal enemies of Israel, so he would not bow the knee. Well, anyway, Haman got so angry, almost psychotically angry, probably psychotically angry, because not only did he want to take out Mordecai, it wasn't enough. He wanted to take out all the Jewish people as a whole. So he flim-flams King Xerxes to sign a decree that will allow him at a certain time, a certain day, and a certain month, just basically to eradicate the Jewish people found in Persia. If there's a Jewish person found within Persia, they'd be eradicated. They'd be killed, destroyed. Well, Mordecai gets his hands on this proclamation, and he goes to Esther, who by now has been elevated to Queen of Persia and has a great deal of favor with the Persian king, Xerxes. And says, listen, you got to speak up. You got to stand up for us, because this guy Haman, he's going to kill every single one of us. And what he ends up telling Esther, when initially he said, first of all, Esther was kind of nervous about doing it. Says, listen, I haven't seen the king's face for a month. He hasn't called me into his presence. And the law of the Medes and Persians is this: if you go into the king's presence without him calling for you to come into his presence, well, he'll execute you unless he extends his golden scepter and then points it at you, and then you're okay, you're saved. He said, he hasn't called me in over a month, so I don't even know if I'm still in favor with him. So Mordecai answers. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? And I want to talk about that. And here's the point. There is several times in this book where it just so happened seems to be the theme of what's going on. At the very beginning of the book, right after Esther is taken into the harem, as we say, this gathering of virgins for this beauty pageant, and of course Mordecai is kind of hanging out around there because he wants to see how his adoptive daughter's doing, because he loves her and he cares for her. And because of this, he just so happens to be in place to hear two of the king's watchmen, a guy by the name of Bigthana and another guy by the name of Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So because he was there, because Esther was selected to be a part of this beauty pageant to see who the next king of Persia would be, queen of Persia would be, he was able to hear this, and because Esther was selected by Queen Xerxes to be his new queen, Mordecai was able to bend her ear, get the warning to King Xerxes, and the assassination plot against him by these two officers of his personal guard, that assassination was quashed. Just so happened. Okay? So fast forward. Shortly after this, Haman becomes prime minister. Everybody else bows the knee to Haman, except for Mordecai. Haman is ticked off. Don't know if it's because of what took place between the Jews and Amalekites and King Agag, because what ended up happening with King Agag is when Samuel, the prophet, ended up visiting the camp, and this is right after the battle with the Amalekites. Saul comes out and said, I did exactly what God said. I destroyed. I think it was in 1 Samuel 15 this is recorded. And he comes out and he says, I have destroyed the Amalekites. I have wiped them out. Them and their stuff. And Samuel says to Saul, said, then what is this lowing of cattle and bleating of sheep that I hear? Oh, well, we kept the best stuff so we could sacrifice it to God. And then when Samuel pushing me more says, well, I was afraid of the men. If I killed them, I was afraid what they were going. I thought they were going to revolt. So he's backpedaling. He's coming up with excuses. And he also finds out that Agag was spared too, who is, by the way, Haman's ancestor, several hundred years back, ancestor. So what ends up happening is Samuel did with Agag as God told Saul to do. He grabbed a sword and he basically cut Agag to pieces. Haman probably knows about this. He's got an axe to grind based upon this, and now you throw on top of that this Jew, this upstart Jew, won't bow the knee to him, and now he's really ticked. He's really angry. So he hatches this plan, as we discussed before, to kill the Jewish people. So, ends up happening is that Esther gets wind of this. She ends up being courageous. She puts on her royal robes, pretties herself up, and she makes her way into the courthouse. And there's this really cool movie called Esther, where it shows her like outside of the court where he's gathered. It's kind of like an outdoor type setup. She pushes the door open with both hands and courageously strides into the presence of Xerxes, who takes his scepter once he sees it's Esther, and he extends it to her. And she walks up to it, and she touches it, and he said, Esther, my dear, what can I do for you? I'll give you up to half the kingdom right now. What can I do for you? And she says, I'd like you and Haman to come to lunch tomorrow. Oh, that's great. That's great. Okay, if that's what you want. I said, if you come to lunch tomorrow, I'll talk to you more about it. So they make arrangements. Haman's feeling great because the queen invited him along with the king to lunch. So he's feeling pretty good about himself. So they go to the first lunch, and the king said, okay, Esther, great meal, thank you, but what can I give you? What can I do for you? And she said, may the king not be angry at me. May he continue to extend his grace. Can you come back tomorrow for lunch again? He said, why not? Yeah, and she promised. I said, I'll tell you exactly what's on my heart at that point. So you and Haman both. I'd like you both here. So Haman gets absolutely beamy happy. Not only was he invited to lunch once by the queen directly, it was twice. So he's feeling pretty self-important, good about himself. So what ends up happening is, in the 5th chapter, he ends up making his way home, and he's whistling, and he's happy. Runs across Mordecai. Mordecai, once again, would not bow to him. And after all this good that happens to Haman, he's so taken and held sway by bitterness and anger. All that wonderful positivity just flowed right out of the situation, and he starts sulking. And he goes home. And he talks to his wife, and he said, you know, that Mordecai, I'm just, He won't bow the knee to me, and he's one of them Jews, and you know what the Jews did to our people a long time ago, and he's really angry. So his wife says, why tolerate this? Build a gallows right in their backyard, which is big stake and platform for impaling people in the backyard, and have the king sentence Mordecai to death in the morning. And immediately, this sick, twisted monkey finds this to be very encouraging, and he does just that. They erect a gallows right in the backyard. Boom, ready to go. Set it for Mordecai. Well, we're going to come across a just so happens moment again. This is in the 6th chapter. That night the king, that's Xerxes, could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, the two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Now bear in mind, this is at nighttime. Haman just so happens to be there. Then the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he set up, remember, in his backyard. This is where it gets really funny. His attendant answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there then that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Okay, this is what I said. Boy, I'm going to be set up really good here. Okay, this is what Haman's thinking, and then the script flips. Just so happens. Remember, Haman couldn't wait till morning. He just had the gallows finished. He's on his way to talk to the King Xerxes about impaling Mordecai on the implement that he just built in his backyard. Okay? So here's where we're at. This is Xerxes. Go at once, the king commanded to Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, led him on horseback before him. This is what is done for the man who the king delights to honor. No, this is Haman doing this for Mordecai. You know this has got to be killing him. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. That's how unpretentious Mordecai is. He went right back to his job. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife said to him, Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther prepared. Okay, here's another one of those fingerprint situations. Notice what he said, because this guy's of Jewish descent. All right? It says in Genesis 12:1 of Abraham and his descendants, whoever blesses you I will bless, whoever curses you I will curse. There's a prophet for hire that was named Balaam, hired by Balak to curse the Jewish people several hundred years after these words were spoken to Abraham, and all he could do is bless him. And it's really interesting. Now we see, well, he's of Jewish descent. You're done. You've tried to bring harm to one of God's people. You're done. So chapter 7 opens with, once again, Haman and King Xerxes is at the feasting table with Esther. And finally, Xerxes can't handle suspense any longer. So, honey, you got to tell me. What do you want? What's on your heart? I'm here for you. Just tell me. And she says, listen, there is a guy who's trying to wipe me out and all of my people. She's like, the king's like, who? Who would do such a dastardly thing? Who would try to kill you? You're amazing. Who would try to do that? Who would kill you? And your people? Who is the name of this villain? And she points. Haman. The villain, Haman. She points right at him. Now the king stalks out of there. He just stalks out of the banquet room. Stalks out of there. He got to get some air. He's got to try to calm down because he is ragingly angry. Now at this point, Haman falls right on his knees before Esther and grabs a hold of her and tries to beg for mercy and beg for his life. Just then, Xerxes comes back in and sees him clinging to her. Says, I can't believe this. Not only are you trying to kill her and her people, you're trying to assault the king's wife while he's out of the room? What gives? And one of his officials said, Haman built this really convenient gallows in his backyard. The king said, well, that's great. It's there. Hang him from it. So here we go. Haman is hung from the very gallows that he created to kill Mordecai the Jew. Now, what goes even further is Esther saying, listen, on this day and in this month, and it's coming up quickly, probably within about a month or so, Haman, your order to eradicate the Jewish people has been issued, and that's what's going to happen. What's really interesting is Haman actually cast lots to decide upon when and at what day and what month that he was going to get this done. He's casting lots. It's kind of like throwing dice. He was casting lots, seeking a guidance on what day and what month to pick. And it came up to the last month of the Jewish year, the month of Adar, on the 12th day, that this would take place. So what ended up happening is, since the king couldn't say, stop it, don't do it, because once a law has been signed into being and a decree is given by the king, it can't be reversed. That's just the way the jurisprudence and legal code of the Medes and the Persians was. So he issued another one saying that the Jewish people could defend themselves. Now, the Jewish people were at the very end of their exile. Their 70-year exile because of their disobedience to God. At this point, they repented. They asked God for forgiveness. They turned back to him. So the Jewish people were not a people to mess with. It's just like Balaam told Balak. He says, listen, these people are blessed by God. You don't want to mess with them. God's anger and his discipline their sentence was over. They were turning back home. There were several Jews that, like in this situation, decided just to stay in Persia because they liked it there. But a lot of Jewish people already started heading home. So that's at the time of history right now. The Jewish exile is over. They're starting to head back home, and God's anger for them has abated, which is dangerous for any enemy of the Jews, because that means, guess what? God had disciplined them and taken care of them for 70 years while they were in captivity in Babylon, now in Persia. Now they're free to go home. God's like, okay, they served their sentence. My anger's spent. Let's let my people go back home. So at this point, Haman gets this harebrained scheme to try to kill all the Jewish people. Well, what ended up happening is they all end up mustering, since the king gave them permission to do so, and wherever they were attacked, they defended themselves, and they did such a successful job at defending themselves that the people were scared of the Jewish people because they were so fierce warriors. They're such fierce warriors. And we got the Jewish feast of Purim, because the word Pur means, in Persian, means lot, because Haman cast the lot to decide that it would be the last month of the year, the 12th day of the year, where he was going to exterminate the Jewish people. And it didn't happen. What ended up happening is the Jewish people stood, defended themselves, and prospered from that moment on. And the point of the matter of this whole thing is, we go back to the beginning of chapter 6. The king couldn't sleep. And it's the night that Haman erected the gallows. Is a night that Haman was going to ask to kill Mordecai. The king ended up getting the records and finding out that Mordecai saved his life all those years ago. And it just set the entire set of events into motion. Now, the retelling of the story took a while, so I thank your patience with me for it. But in all this, God is not mentioned directly. However, you could tell that certain portions of what's happened in this book of Esther harken back to Scripture. Haman's wife and his officials saying, listen, you're going up to somebody to get Jewish assent, you're in trouble. We go back to Genesis 12:1, where God said to Abraham, those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse. That's back when his name was Abram. Before he ended up leaving Ur of Chaldea, which is right around the same area where the story of Esther took place, roughly. So that's a really interesting coincidence. The fact that the king couldn't sleep on the night that Haman built the gallows was an interesting coincidence. The very fact that it says in the book of Proverbs, those who dig a pit will fall in it, those who set a snare will be caught by it, and we see Haman hung by his own gallows. It kind of reminds me of something that's been in the news, like it was in the news a few days ago, and that is that apparently the Russians tried using chemical munitions on Ukraine because things weren't going well in the battle, so they used outlawed ordnance, chemical weapons. And then the wind changed direction and blew it right back at the Russians. And it said just immediately. The coincidence brings me back to the word coincidence. Albert Einstein said, coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous. And there's also a lot of other great quotes about coincidences and how coincidences are really not coincidences. And I guess all of this is to say, in our lives, we may see situations in which we don't see God, okay? We don't see Him. He's not apparent. We're in a dark situation, a bad situation. We can't see the light of day. But if you look carefully enough and you know the Word because you're in it, you look really carefully, you'll see his fingerprints. And that's the story of Esther. The story of Esther is God's fingerprints everywhere, even though he's not overtly mentioned. And the very fact that Esther asked Mordecai and the people to fast and to put on sackcloth and ashes, which is what they did when they were mourning, and what they did also when they were praying for something enormous. She didn't say prayer, but she said, have people fast, because she was about to go talk to the king. She said, I need people fasting for me. I need people to get serious about this. And of course, I think they were fasting, they were praying that God would grant Esther favor when she walked into Xerxes' court without invitation. He pointed the scepter and he extended grace. And Haman ended up getting hung on the same gallows that he intended for Mordecai. Beloved, there's going to be many times where it's going to seem like God is nowhere to be seen. But his fingerprints are there. He's been there before us. He promised to go before us. And we see this in the book of Esther. And I think that's what it is. Esther is a Where's Waldo kind of thing. You know that funny picture book where Waldo's like embedded in this activity and all these little pictures, and somewhere there's a little guy with a red and white striped long sleeve shirt and the hat, and it's like Esther's like, where's Yahweh? Where's Yahweh? He's there. He's in every detail. We're told in Ephesians chapter 1 verse 11 that God works out all things according to the counsel of his will. Jesus said, when dealing with people's concern about their welfare, he said, listen, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, yet not one of them hits the ground apart from your Father's will? And you are worth many, many more sparrows. The very number of the hairs of your head are numbered. God is in the details. I hear you say the devil's in the details. God is there. Esther, God's not mentioned once, but he's everywhere. He's everywhere. He's keeping the king awake. He puts Esther in the beauty pageant. He allows Mordecai to be able to overhear the plot that would have had Xerxes assassinated. Saves the king's life. Reminds the king later when he can't sleep at night that Mordecai was the one who saved him. And in doing that, saves Mordecai's life from Haman, who had constructed a gallows to hang Mordecai from. And allows God's people to defend themselves against their enemies. God is there. You may not see him, I may not see him at times, but his fingerprints are everywhere. And I just want to leave you with that. I know it's been a long rant, but the story of Esther deserved to be told. Because it's a beautiful story about female empowerment. Esther turns out to be a courageous woman of integrity, one that we could all emulate. And it turns out to be a story of God's behind-the-scenes providence and protection. Take heart. If you look carefully, you will see God's fingerprints. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. May God bless you. My name's Eric. This is my rant. If you like the story, please hit like. If you have questions or comments, please utilize the comment section. And of course, if you think this thing needs to be shared so other people can be encouraged, even though they may not see God and what's going on in their lives, please hit share. Thank you. Have a blessed day.